The Iron Spire, War Council Chamber, silence after the video ends. Vrakkel's claws froze over the throne's armrest, mid-tap, and did not move again. The screen in front of him held one frame, a ship's hull, catching light for half a second. Then gone, not blurred, not jammed. Gone, the way a word disappears when you forget it mid-sentence. He ran the footage back. He watched it again. The result did not change. No warning, no weapons fire, no trace on a single sensor in his fleet. Behind him, 43 holographic displays hummed with the readings of 15 conquered systems, and none of them could explain the empty space where a human ship had been. The Phantom Shroud. That was the name stamped at the bottom corner of the file in a language his translator rendered flat and strange. 2 words. He said them out loud, once, and the chamber swallowed the sound. At the highest row of seats, Elder Sarvak did not look at him. She did not need to. Her data slate glowed faintly against her small gray hands, open to a page 320 years old. Something small and wrong sat at the edge of the frozen image, easy to miss. The timestamp read 11 minutes before the transmission arrived. 11 minutes inside his own flagship, and not one alarm had sounded. He wanted to call it a trick. His mouth would not make the word. I wish I could tell you the silence broke there. It didn't. Stay with me. The quiet is the loudest part of this story. 9 days earlier, the vote had been 317 to 14. The chamber had laughed then. A different kind of sound, dry, certain, the laugh of an empire that had scanned 94 human ships across 28 years and found nothing in any of them worth a second look. Primitive alloy, kinetic weapons, no shields worth the name. The classification stamped across every file, low priority protectorate. Elder Sarvak had stood to speak a 9th time. 9 warnings in 9 years, and 9 times the council had voted her down before she finished a sentence. This time she said only 4 words. You are not looking. Nobody had asked what she meant. 400 light-years away, on a station shaped like a slow ring of metal and light, Admiral Theron Valdez was drinking tea. He did this every morning at the same hour, in a chair worn soft in the shape of his own back, with a small photograph propped against the lamp, a woman who had been gone 12 years now, and whose face he still checked against every morning like a man confirming a fact. Beside the cup sat a logbook, leather-bound, brass at the corners, the cover gone smooth from decades of one man's hands. He opened it to page 1 out of habit more than need. The first entry was dated the day the Zarveth first scanned a human ship. He had been writing in it ever since. His niece, Commander Kaylin Valdez, came in without knocking. She folded her hands in front of her the way she always did when she had bad news and wanted to look calm delivering it. The vote came back, she said. 317 to 14. They're filing us as low priority. Valdez read the report once. Then again. He set the cup down without a sound. 28 years, he said. And they still haven't looked twice at a single one of our ships. The program's ready, sir. It has been for years. We've never needed to. He closed the logbook. Wake the Phantom Shroud. 3 decks below, in a lab that smelled of solder and cold coffee. Dr. Kira Salan had been waiting for that sentence for most of her adult life. She wore the same maroon coat she'd worn since the project's first day, a coffee stain on the left cuff she'd stopped trying to get out around year 14. Her son, Lieutenant Commander Jax Solon, sat 2 consoles down, running one last check on the masking array he'd built with his own hands. A photograph of his 8-year-old daughter taped to the corner of his screen. Fields holding at 0 thermal bleed, he said. Gravity lattice stable. She's ready, Mom. Kira didn't answer right away. She was looking at a number on her own screen, a program that had run without a single detection for 28 years, about to be tested where it mattered. Tell Captain Valdez, she said finally, that her ship has somewhere to be. Behind Ciaris, in a shipyard that did not appear on any registered chart, 800 engineers, who had sworn to a secret they'd kept for almost 3 decades, watched a single vessel clear its berth. The ship was small, no larger than a cargo hauler, its hull built to answer every frequency with nothing at all. It had no engines in any sense the Zarveth would recognize, no heat, no exhaust, no signature to catch. Only a slow bending of gravity around its own skin, quiet as a held breath. Captain Lyra Valdez sat in the command chair, scarred knuckles resting on the console, and said nothing at all as the dock fell away behind her. She had never needed many words. Tonight she needed even fewer. somewhere past the dark, a fleet of 14 capital ships and 38 support vessels sat parked in the region they called the Veil Expanse, scanning nearly 5 million cubic kilometers of space every second, utterly certain there was nothing there worth finding. She checked her heading once and did not check it again. The Veil Expanse held no stars worth naming, only the drifting dark between systems where the Zarvith fleet had parked itself like a held fist. Captain Valdez watched the tactical display fill with red. 14 capital ships, dozens more support vessels scattered around them in a lattice that looked, from a distance, unbreakable. None of them saw her coming. She didn't think about it as luck. Luck was for people who hadn't spent half their careers building this exact silence. She thought about her mother's coat, stained at the cuff, and the 28 years it had taken to get her here, and then she stopped thinking about anything at all and did her job. The ship threaded the gap between two support vessels with room to spare. Close enough that if either crew had leaned toward a window, had windows existed on ships built for war, not sightseeing, they might have seen a shadow pass where no shadow belonged. Jax's voice came through low, back on Sol Command, delayed by the distance but steady. Fields holding, no return pings. You're a ghost out there, Captain. Copy, she said, and nothing else. She was not there to fight. 8 railguns and 4 missile tubes sat cold and unused in her hull, because the mission had never been about what the ship could destroy. It was about what the ship could see without ever being seen back. She found Vrakel's flagship at the center of the formation, the largest hull in the fleet, plated in black armor scarred from 12 conquests. She slid along its flank at a distance that would have gotten her killed in any war fought the old way. Close enough to touch, almost. Close enough to read the hull markings if she'd cared to. She didn't care to. She had a different kind of proof in mind. Inside the flagship, in a chamber lit low for the sleep cycle his species required, Warlord Vrakel lay in his command chair rather than his bed. He had done this since his first conquest, slept where he ruled, so that no crisis could ever catch him unready. He did not know a small dark shape had drawn level with his own hull, close enough to see through the reinforced viewport into the chamber where he slept. He did not know a single frame was captured, mouth open, a thin line of drool at the corner of his jaw. The great and terrible Warlord Vrakel, undone by an unguarded hour, and no sensor on his ship raised so much as a flicker. The phantom shroud held position for exactly as long as it needed, and not 1 second longer. Back at Sol Command, in a room lit by the glow of a dozen quiet screens, Admiral Valdez set down his tea and opened the channel he'd been waiting 28 years to open. He did not gloat. Gloating wasn't in him. It hadn't been in him in 23 years of war councils where he'd never once raised his voice, and he didn't see a reason to start now with the whole galaxy about to be listening. He simply said, "Send it." The image left Sol Command and arrived in the heart of the Zarvith fleet on an open channel, not hidden, not encrypted, not routed through some back door. Sent plainly, the way you'd hand someone a photograph across a table. In the Iron Spire, alarms began to sound before anyone understood why. Vrakel woke to the sound of his own bridge crew shouting, and the first thing he saw on his own private feed was himself. Asleep, mouth open, a stranger's camera 3 meters from his face. He came up out of the chair so fast his ceremonial helm clattered to the floor. "Who?" he said, and found he had no end to the sentence. His tactical officer had no answer either. No ship had registered on any scan. No breach alarm had triggered. As far as every instrument on the flagship could tell, nothing had ever been there. Vrakel's talons found the armrest and began to tap. Once, twice, he was not aware he was doing it. Elder Sarvak, watching from her quarters on a secondary feed, closed her eyes for a moment before opening them again. 9 warnings, 9 years, she had not needed a 10th. The fleet went into a state that had no name in Zarvith military doctrine, not battle-ready, because there was no enemy to aim at, and not stand down, because something plainly hostile had proven it could reach any one of them at will. Vrakel opened a channel to Sol Command himself. His voice, when it came through, had lost the flatness it usually carried. "You will explain this," he said. "What trickery is this?" Admiral Valdez was still holding his cup. 3 hours ago, he said, a single human vessel crossed your entire perimeter, came within reach of your own flagship, and left again. No one on your fleet noticed. Impossible. I have the footage of the approach as well, if you'd like to see it. Vrakel's talons stopped moving. "Send it," he said, and the words came out smaller than he meant them to. Back in the Iron Spire, 43 displays now carried the same feed, broadcast to every seat in the council chamber whether its occupant wanted to see it or not. The image resolved, the phantom shroud, small and unremarkable, easing out of a dock behind a rock most star charts didn't bother naming. Then the hull shimmered, the way heat shimmers over pavement, and the ship was gone, not cloaked, not jammed in any sense a Zarvith engineer would recognize as jamming, simply absent, the way a word disappears when the mind that held it lets go. Somewhere in the chamber, someone made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Elder Sarvek sat very still, her data slate dark in her lap, its old file finally uselessly vindicated. No warning had come from any sensor. No breach had registered on any log. No alarm on any ship in the fleet had ever sounded, and that, more than the photograph, more than the vanishing, was the detail that would keep every officer in that chamber awake for nights afterward. "We have been watching you for 28 years, Admiral Valdez said, and something in the way he said it made even the silence in the Iron Spire feel deliberate. You laughed at our silence. We were the reason you had nothing to hear. Nobody in the chamber laughed now." Vrak Kells stood over the frozen frame of his own sleeping face, and for the first time in a war career built on 12 conquered systems, he did not know what order to give next. Vrak Kells' answer came not as an order, but as a question, and questions were not a thing he asked. "Run every scan again," he said. "All of them. Now." His tactical crew obeyed within seconds, and within seconds more, the answer came back the same as before. Nothing. No trace, no residue, no thermal ghost. The phantom shroud had been and gone as though it had never existed at all. "That is not possible," he said, to no one now, because no one on his bridge had an answer to give him. From the highest row of the council chamber, a voice spoke that had not been heard in open session in 9 years. "It is not only possible," Elder Sarvek said. "It has been happening the whole time." Every head in the Iron Spire turned toward her at once. She rose from her seat, small against the black volcanic stone, and set her data slate on the rail in front of her, so the nearest screens could pick up its glow. "Human ships have flickered on long-range sensors for decades," she said. "A half-second dropout, gone before anyone thought to flag it. I logged the first instance 320 years ago. I have logged 140 more since. I brought this to the council 9 times. 9 times I was told I was reading noise." Vrakel's talons found the armrest again. "You never said." "I said it 9 times, Sarvak said. "You were not listening. None of you were looking for a species that would build a weapon and then choose, for decades, never to use it." A murmur ran the length of the chamber, low and uneasy, the sound of an empire's certainty developing its first visible crack. 3 hours later, in the quiet of his quarters, Admiral Valdez sat with his tea gone cold beside him. He had not touched it. He turned his logbook over once in his hands, feeling the worn smoothness of the leather, and did not open it yet. Kellen came in without knocking again, though this time she didn't fold her hands. She just stood in the doorway. "They're not moving, sir. No retaliation order, no fleet maneuver. Nothing. They will," Valdez said. "Give them time to understand what they're looking at." He reached for the tea out of habit, found it cold, and set it down again without drinking. It was a small thing, the kind of gesture that meant nothing on its own. A man forgetting his own cup because his mind had gone somewhere else entirely. In the lab 3 decks down, Jack Solan sat very still in front of a screen that no longer needed watching. The mission was over. The ship was home, undetected, exactly as designed. He should have felt something like triumph. Instead, he found himself looking at the photograph taped to his console. His daughter, 8 years old, gap-toothed, caught mid-loft in a park that no longer existed the way it had when the picture was taken. 28 years, his mother said behind him, not really to him. "I started this before you were born." "I know, Mom. I used to wonder if we'd ever get to use it." Kira Solan's hand rested briefly on his shoulder. "I never wondered whether it would work. I always knew it would. I wondered whether we'd have the patience to wait." Jax didn't answer. He was thinking about all the nights she'd missed at home while he was small, and how none of them had felt like patience at the time. They just felt like absence. It was strange, he thought, how a thing could be both. Aboard the Zarvith flagship, Vrakel stood alone at last. The council session ended, the chamber emptied around him. He replayed the footage a final time, the ship shimmering out of existence, and this time he did not tap his talons. He simply watched and let himself understand it the way he had refused to before. 12 conquered systems. 12 ritual scars across his carapace, one for each. He had built an entire career on the idea that strength announced itself, that a species worth fearing made itself known through force visible enough to measure. He had never once considered that the deepest kind of strength might choose to say nothing at all. Ambassador Kalen of the Kaelari, small and unassuming, had watched the broadcast from his private chambers with a stone from a world he had visited 82 years ago turning slowly between his fingers. He had traded with humans for most of that time. He had never once asked them the question everyone in the Iron Spire was now asking. He had simply assumed, the way a careful trader assumes, that anyone patient enough to keep a secret that long had earned the right to keep it. He set the stone down and did not reach for it again. 68 hours after the photograph reached the fleet, the withdrawal order finally came not from Vrakel, but from the Zarveth High Command above him, 3 systems away, who had watched the same footage and drawn the same conclusion faster than their warlord had. No shots fired. No formal surrender. Just 14 capital ships and their support vessels turning, one by one, and leaving the Vale Expanse the way they had come. It should have felt like victory at Sol Command. It felt, instead, like the moment after holding your breath too long, the relief arriving alongside something closer to exhaustion, but the retreat was not the end of it, and everyone who understood the Zarveth well enough knew it. An empire built on 12 conquests does not simply walk away from a wound to its own certainty. Somewhere in that withdrawing fleet doctrine that had stood unquestioned for 4,000 years had just been proven wrong in front of every officer who served it, and an empire does not survive that kind of proof quietly. Elder Sarvik understood this better than anyone in the chamber. As the last Zarveth vessel folded away into the dark, she opened her data slate one final time, to a page she had never shown the council, and read a single line she had written 300 years before any human ship had ever crossed a Zarveth sensor. The line said, "A species that hides its strength this well is not hiding from fear. It is hiding for a reason." She had never known what that reason was. By morning ship time, a private channel opened between Sol Command and the Iron Spire. Not a demand this time, but a request, routed through Ambassador Kalen, who had never once in 82 years of quiet trade asked humans a direct question and found, apparently, tonight, for the first time in 3 centuries, she thought she might be about to find out, and the thought did not comfort her at all. Sarvak's unease did not last the night, that he finally had one worth asking. Valdez took the call in his quarters. Tea fresh. Logbook closed on the desk beside him, brass corners catching the lamp. Kalen's voice came through soft, unhurried, the kind of voice built for negotiating over decades rather than minutes. Elder Sarvak wishes to know something, not for the council record. For herself, I'm listening. 28 years of silence, and you never used it to strike first. You had the ship, you had the access. You could have ended Vrakel in his sleep instead of photographing him in it. A pause, careful. The way a man chooses a question he suspects will matter more than the answer. Why patience, Admiral? Why not the easier cruelty? Valdez turned the logbook over once under his hand, the way he always did when he needed a moment before answering something that mattered. Because the point was never to hurt him, he said. The point was to be seen clearly once after 280 years of not being seen at all. A dead warlord teaches an empire nothing. A live one who has to sit with what he saw that teaches something. Kalen was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that traveled well even across the distance the signal had to cross. You built a weapon and used it to ask a question. That's the only kind worth building. The call ended there. It was not a large moment. No alarms behind it, no music. Just 2 old men on either side of a war that hadn't been fought, agreeing on something neither of them said outright. Valdez sat with the silence after the channel closed longer than he needed to. Outside his window, Earth turned the pale blue it always turned, indifferent to whether an empire 400 light-years away had just begun rewriting 3 centuries of doctrine because of a photograph. He found that indifference comforting, in its way. The planet didn't need to know what had almost happened to it. That was rather the point of the last 28 years. Word of the exchange reached Vrakel within the day, relayed through channels that no longer bothered pretending to be secret. He heard it standing alone in the council chamber, the 43 displays around him dark for the first time in longer than he could remember. Dark screens in a room built for certainty felt to him like a wound left open on purpose. He thought of his own scars, 12 of them, one for every system he'd bent to the Empire's will through exactly the kind of visible, announced force Admiral Valdez had just described, calmly to an ambassador who wasn't even human, as the easier cruelty. He had never once had to sit with what any of his conquests saw in the moment they understood they'd lost. He had never given them the chance. He had always made certain the ending came fast, loud, and undeniable, because that was what strength was supposed to look like. He was beginning to understand that it was also, possibly, the smaller kind. He went to his private quarters and found himself standing in front of the mirror bolted to the wall. Not a vanity, just a piece of equipment every officer's quarters carried, meant for checking the fit of a helm before a ceremony. He looked at his own reflection the way he had looked at the frozen frame of himself asleep, as though trying to locate the moment the person in front of him had stopped being someone an empire could rely on to be simply, uncomplicatedly sure of things. The inquiry began within the week, not into Vrakel's conduct during the incident. There had been no misconduct, only humiliation, and no doctrine punished a warlord for being outmatched by something no sensor in the fleet could find. The inquiry was into the doctrine itself. 3 centuries of measuring every rival species by what could be scanned, catalogued, and ranked by visible strength, a doctrine that had just failed completely and publicly against a species that had chosen for decades not to be measured at all. The proceedings were long, procedural, and largely bloodless, the way institutions correct themselves when the alternative is admitting they were built wrong from the start. Officers who had once laughed loudest at the 94 scanned human ships now sat in closed sessions arguing over how the classification files should be rewritten and whether primitive had ever been the right word for a species that could apparently do this. Nobody wanted to be the one who'd voted 317 to 14. Several claimed, quietly, to have abstained. The record did not support most of them. Vrakel was not stripped of his rank, nothing so clean as that. He was simply reassigned without ceremony to a garrison command 3 systems from anywhere that mattered, a posting meant for warlords whose careers had reached their natural end without the dignity of an obvious defeat. His 12 conquests remained his own, listed on his record exactly as they had always been. His certainty did not survive the transfer. He kept one thing from the incident, a single still frame saved without authorization to a private drive of himself asleep and unaware, drool at the corner of his jaw, a stranger's camera 3 meters from his face. He never explained to anyone why he kept it. He looked at it sometimes, late, in the small garrison quarters that were nothing like the command chair he used to sleep in out of habit and pride. He no longer slept in his command chair. He had learned, finally, what it cost to be caught somewhere you assumed no one could reach. He did not hate Admiral Valdez for it. That surprised him more than anything else the last months had taught him. Hatred required believing the other side had cheated. What the humans had done wasn't cheating, it was patience, applied for longer than his own species generally lived, aimed at a single quiet purpose, to be underestimated exactly long enough for the underestimating to matter. He kept the photograph. He never once tried to have it deleted. Elder Sarvak retired from active council session not long after, though nobody forced the decision. She simply stopped attending, and the Iron Spire, for the first time in longer than most of its current members could remember, held its sessions without anyone in the high seats willing to say the thing no one wanted to hear. She spent the months after cataloging the flickers she'd first noticed 3 centuries before, hundreds of half-second dropouts across hundreds of scans, each one now finally understood for what it was, not glitches. Not sensor noise, the excuse she'd been handed 9 separate times across 9 separate years, the edge of a patience so long it had outlasted her own doubt about ever seeing its purpose fulfilled in her lifetime. She wrote a final entry into her own record, meant for no council and no vote, the kind of thing historians write for no one but themselves. A species that hides its strength this well is not hiding from fear, she had written 300 years earlier, without knowing what would eventually prove her right. Now beneath it she added a second line. It was hiding for the same reason a good hand holds its cards until the moment they matter. Not cowardice, timing. She never showed it to anyone it didn't need showing. She had spent 9 warnings and 3 centuries being right in a room that refused to listen, and she found in the end that being right quietly was enough. It was. Kalen reflected once to no one in particular, a better foundation for a friendship than most he'd built across 2 centuries of careful diplomacy, the simple, rare comfort of 2 parties who had both in their own ways. Ambassador Kalen kept trading with humans exactly as he had for 82 years, though something in the manner of it changed. He no longer assumed, he asked, plainly, the way he had asked about the photograph, and found that Admiral Valdez answered plainly in return. On sole command, Jack Solan finally slept a full night for the first time in longer than he could count, and woke to find his mother already awake in the small galley kitchen they shared a level below their quarters, the same maroon coat draped over the back of her chair. Learned the cost of pretending to know more than they did. He kept the small, smooth stone from earth in his pocket, the way he always had. He touched it. Sometimes when he wanted to remember that patience, handled well, was not the same thing as waiting for nothing. Budget's not exactly the concern it used to be. I know. Kira Solan didn't look up from the datapad she was reading, decommissioning notes for the project that had eaten 28 years of her life. Coffee stain and all. You could replace that coat now, he said, pouring a cup of his own, filed now under a classification that finally read something other than primitive. I might, someday. You won't. No, she agreed. I won't. He sat across from her and thought, not for the first time, about the years the project had taken, years he'd spent as a boy noticing his mother's absence more than her purpose, the way children do, unable to see the shape of a long patience from inside it. He understood it differently now. He didn't resent it any less for understanding it. He simply carried both at once, the way people learn to carry most true things.
6 months after the fleet's withdrawal, Admiral Valdez sat in his quarters at the same hour he always did, tea steaming beside him, the small photograph of his wife catching the same lamplight it always had.
He took the photograph of his daughter off the console that night and put it in a frame instead, on the shelf above his bed, where it wouldn't need to travel with him on every mission from here on. The Phantom Shroud's active service for now was done. He found he didn't mind. It was a small thing, almost a habit rather than a decision. The way his hand found the leather cover without needing to look, the way it always had for 28 years. Her expression unchanged by 6 months or 6 years or the 28 that had come before them. He reached for the logbook, through council votes and quiet mornings and one afternoon that had ended in Empire's certainty without firing a shot. He opened it past the last written page. 47 pages of dates and observations, small and even, a lifetime's patience rendered in handwriting that had barely changed across 3 decades. A single pressed violet marked the final entry, flattened now to the thinness of paper itself. He had picked that flower the day his wife died, and pressed it there without quite deciding to, and it had stayed. Page 47, the last thing he'd written before this one. He turned to the blank page after it. He dipped his pen. He wrote 3 words, slow, the way a man writes something he intends to still be legible in another 28 years. If anyone still cared to read it by then, the Phantom Shroud. He did not write anything else. No explanation. No account of the council, the vote, the photograph, the withdrawal, the reassigned warlord, 3 systems from anywhere that mattered. Just the name, in the same steady hand that had filled every page before it, sitting now beside a pressed flower, and a lifetime of dates that had all, in their own quiet way, been leading here. He closed the book. Somewhere past the dark edge of the solar system, a fleet that no longer believed what it once had was still finding its way home, carrying a doctrine in pieces and a warlord who now kept a photograph of his own sleeping face, where no one else could see it. He set it beside the tea, the way he always did, and for a moment neither the tea, nor the logbook, nor the small photograph in its lamplight frame moved at all, and looked at it sometimes the way a man looks at a scar he gave himself. You laughed at our silence, the Admiral had told them, and no one who had heard it that night had laughed since. He picked up the cup. The tea was still warm.